Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I hope you're all well. I'm delighted today to be joined by Raj Kumar, who is the president and editor-in-chief of Devex, a very innovative media platform for the global development community. So welcome, Raj. Great to have you with us.
Thanks, Pierre. Yeah, really nice to get to see you, at least virtually. It's been a while. And really great to be here with all of you who are joining.
It has been a while. So the question, at least in the development community, as you can imagine, is all of these changes, right? COVID and the political situation and the international situation. What impact are you observing? Are you seeing, or what do you forecast will be the impact on the work that we do? Which is not only the fundamental work that we do in the field, but also the financing of it. Whether it be American donations through smallholders, foundations, government, etc. I mean, this whole thing is being thrown up in the air, and I can't wait to hear what you have to say about all this.
Yeah, I don't know about you. I kind of feel like we're living through one of these moments in history that you read about, or that your grandparents tell you about, right? It just seems so iconic. You can't imagine what it was like. And I kind of think we're living through that. And I thought that almost before we had a global pandemic, and now, massive protest movement, maybe kind of a resurgence of a civil rights movement here in the United States, one that is sorely needed, I think. So I think there's just so many issues coming to a head now, and it does pose really big questions to our community at Devex. Our membership are about 1 million development professionals, humanitarian aid workers around the world. And I think what I hear from them is they're all asking lots of really existential questions, about their work, the fundamental nature of their work, the career they've chosen, what it all means. And like you said, how are we going to fund it in the future? I think there's huge issues at stake right now. In fact, I know one of the reasons you invited me is I wrote this book that came out called The Business of Changing the World. And the basic argument I make is that our whole industry is being totally disrupted, just like other industries have been. And I talk about all the new money coming into the sector, especially from billionaires and crowdfunding. I talk about new technologies and whole new models of doing development work, doing humanitarian work. And then you layer on top of that what's happened right now with this global pandemic. And to me, it's just accelerating a moment of real disruption in our sector. So, I'm talking to lots of people like yourself, and what I'm hearing is, many organizations are laying off staff. Many are responding to this challenge by moving more toward localization and trying to hire more people in the countries where they work, trying to, work more directly with local partners. I'm talking to lots of private funders who I think are really realizing they've got to step up in a different way than they have before. They can't be so conservative as they might have been in the past. They have to take on bigger risks. So I do think it's a moment when everyone is asking themselves pretty fundamental questions, and we could see a very different, aid community come out of this on the other end.
Yeah, one of the questions that, and we've been asking ourselves those questions, and we are also not so much laying off, but restructuring the way we want to work. Because one of the questions that I don't hear often enough in the field is, how well are we doing? How well are all these projects? And we've sort of come to a conclusion that this sort of 3 to 5 year project cycle is not working. It doesn't work. Yep. So are you hearing people are questioning?
I think so. I think so. It's a big part of why I actually wrote my book. I talk a lot about that because, if you look at the history of our field, a lot of the reason that was shaped in this direction, the reason we have a 3 to 5 year project cycle as kind of the normal unit of activity is government funding. And, government was by far most of the funding in the world. We have all these acronyms in our field, UN agencies and bilateral donors and multilateral donors. But if you really think about it, there's about 5 rich countries in the world that have funded most global aid, in the last 50 years. And because it's government funding, it goes through a very risk-averse approach, which tends to be about the government or some agency like USAID saying, okay, we're going to define a problem, and then we're going to define the solution, and then we're going to find this partner who will go and execute that over the next 3 to 5 years. And a lot of that made sense back in the day, but it doesn't make any sense anymore when we have the ability to use technology to know what's happening in real time, to iterate and change, to take much more into account the voices of the people we're actually trying to work with. putting them in the driver's seat of their own development instead of the decision being made in Washington or London. So, I think that project cycle, the whole way we work, if you run in, as I'm sure people watching this, and maybe you've experienced this, if you run into a friend they haven't seen in a while and you work in global development, often the first question is, hey, what project are you on these days? What are you, this is like the unit of activity. It's projects. And that's not the case for most other fields, right? If you're in business, I know you spend a lot of your career in business, people don't talk about projects. They're building sustainable models to achieve some end result. And I think there's an opportunity now, and you see a lot of things pointing the direction to move our whole community, our whole sector in the direction of saying, okay, what's the result we want to achieve? And how do we get there? And that should be the focus, not the projects or the funding.
God,
it's about the end result.
I just love what you're saying. That's exactly where Heifer's going, right? And I mean, that's wonderful. In fact, you sound like me talking to my board of directors a couple of months ago. I said, guys, this is over. The 3 to 5, and we've talked about it before, obviously, but that's great. So are you hearing that people are willing to consider that? Because that's so fundamental, right? You're talking, in our business, we talk about rural development, right? Rural development doesn't happen in a 3 to 5 year project. It happens over decades, yep. Right?
Yeah, I mean, one of the examples I use in my book is Hello Tractor, which is like the Uber for tractors, yeah, right? And it's exciting in that, they're using the same kind of tech that you see in many other, enterprises like an Uber. But what the fundamental shift there was to say, we're going to take a social enterprise approach. There's no project cycle. We're going to just figure out what farmers need and try to put them in the driver's seat, give them what they need. They need access to a tractor, they can't afford it. Let's find a way to do it through an Uber type model. Yeah. And actually they got funding from USAID, right? I mean, they got funding from the traditional players. So I think what has happened is we have all this private money. Private money is now maybe half of our industry. It's gotten that big, maybe more. I mean, it's grown dramatically.
Sorry, let me interrupt you for a second. When you say private money, you mean private philanthropy or do you mean capital?
I mean private philanthropy. I'm not even talking about private sector investment, impact investment. I'm talking about Gates Foundation, Bloomberg Foundation, and on, plus individual giving, ordinary people giving money. After the earthquake in Haiti, $500 million raised quickly.
Right. Looks like Raj has gotten stuck in Wi-Fi land.
I used to get my
annual.
I'd get my annual Christmas card when I was a kid with a heifer goat on it, or a chicken. So Heifer's been using private donations for many years.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
To fund this kind of work, but it's accelerating. That private side is accelerating, and so I think the influence of the private side has changed the way government looks at their approach. And then you layer in the technology and the capabilities of actually iterating and measuring quickly. And I think that's why the project cycle, it's not over. Projects are still the main way we think in our industry, but it's quickly shifting.
Yes. I mean, that's really encouraging, because I've been ranting and raving about, because I come from business, as you noted. The idea behind business is you create wealth, you create, assets and infrastructure, and you keep building wealth for the shareholders and for the employees, et cetera. And that's what government should be doing in most of the countries in which we operate. Where do you see and you mentioned very briefly the focus or the push towards localization. Where do you see it happening? Who's doing it, and how the government's getting involved? What are they asking for? We don't want to move from one bureaucratic system to another bureaucratic system.
Yeah, it's fair. I think, I say two things. One is, when we talk about, on this prior point, we talk about using kind of a business approach and getting to a sustainable model. Sometimes people hear that and think, well, you're talking about, wealth creation or business or capitalism. Really, what I think we're talking about are market mechanisms. So you could be a nonprofit. You don't have to make a profit, but you're using the mechanisms of the market instead of a mechanism of a project to achieve an end result. So it doesn't have to be about, we're going to become a business now. And I think it's important when it comes to localization, because, if ultimately your results goals are about long-term sustainability of development, then, you start realizing, well, the only way to get there ultimately is for countries and communities, individuals to be in charge of their own destiny, right? And
Yeah.
so you
Right.
got to be ceding more and more authority and power, even though we know the resources are still largely in some of the richest countries in the world. That's a reality of the world we live in. But how do you get to the stage where a lot of the activity and the decision making is being made closer to the ground and closer to the end users, the people who are trying to be helped? Because in the end, that's the only way you get there, actually, is by listening. And I think the protest movements we're seeing in the United States now, interestingly, helped it, inform a lot of the move that we see in development thinking. There's a whole move toward decolonizing development. And it's really
Yes.
connected to this idea of localization, right? Our whole industry came out of the colonial era. It came out of an imperialist era. And it was built on many good intentions, of course, well-intentioned people wanting to do good things in the world and address poverty. But it was built as a top-down industry. Decisions are made in conference rooms by the people who hold the purse strings. And that is starting to shift. And
Of a
exactly
particular
these kind of,
skin color.
exactly, and I think that the kind of model we're talking about, moving to market mechanisms, it's in itself a kind of power shift,
Yeah.
because what you're doing is saying, well, actually, it's the people on the ground who make the decisions. They have the authority. Their voice matters in the process. And so I think it's part of a larger shift toward understanding the rights-based equation here that is ultimately what development's all about. And to answer your question, I think there are a lot of examples of donors moving to, pushing money to localize, to incent the use of people on the ground, to removing citizenship barriers and hiring. There are many, many examples of it.
Yeah. One of the interesting things that we're finding in the way that we do the project and we do the development is that local community, as well as local provincial governments, municipal governments, actually have been receiving more resources from the central government. And that has been, and we've accessed that. We call it, catalyzing local funds. And right now, our measurement of it is that local funding is actually greater than the funding we're sending overseas, which actually is a major shift, right? Now, it's not necessarily through our books, you won't see it in the 990s, but it is actually happening because it is oriented towards the same activity, or in fact, supporting the activity that we've sort of designed with the community.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, Pierre. And to me, it points to one other thing that's important for all of us to remember is we don't want to move from one overly simplistic model to another.
Yeah.
And so our old one was pretty simplistic. I mean, it's still there today, where we say there's the rich world and the poor world, the developed and developing, right? Global North, global South. And we know you spend a lot of time traveling all over the world, that does not describe the richness of the diversity of the world.
Oh, no, absolutely.
There's so much diversity within countries, right? They're vulnerable, marginalized groups. I mean, it's a complex stew, and we should embrace that. We shouldn't just sort of say, and this is where the bureaucracy could become a problem. Well, localization is good. So, move money from organizations in the US to organizations in the global South, and then we're done. Our job here is done. There's so much more complexity than that. Are all governments in developing countries doing the right things? No. Are they spending enough on health and education? No. It's not just about getting resources to them. It's a more nuanced picture.
Yeah.
And that's why I think the mission of our industry is so important. It has to come down to that mission about rights and about poverty reduction. And if that's your North Star, you can make smart decisions in different cases about how to get there.
Yeah. So, one of the potential consequences of all this potential restriction or reallocation of funds is that, at least let's just take the international sector only. There may be several organizations that are just not caught by this reduction of revenue and will look for either mergers or are you feeling that this is happening or likely to happen? Because from a business point of view, when I look at the field, it is grossly overserviced in a way in terms of the number of organizations, right? And that may include Heifer, by the way. I don't think so, but and I'm not saying that big is necessarily the right solution, but there are so many different organizations with all their own overhead, right?
You're onto something I hear from a lot of executives in this field. And if you look historically, in Devex, we've done some reporting on this. If you look at the mergers and acquisitions that happen among international nonprofits, they basically happen out of weakness. So somebody is going bankrupt, someone is insolvent, someone is having problems. Then they say, their board and their executives say, hey, we're ready to merge. Who will absorb us? And that is not the way it works in the business world. It's the exact opposite. In the business world, mergers and acquisitions tend to happen out of strength, right? Some small startup is doing great, and then a bigger fish says, hey, how do we acquire all that ingenuity and all that innovation? Let's bring them in. We want that growth in that market. So I think we've got it backwards in our field. We're doing it for the wrong reasons. And unfortunately, because you're going to see a lot of negative financial impact due to the pandemic, you're going to see a lot of mergers and acquisitions. I'm hearing lots about it. You will see it, I think. You'll see an uptick. But it's the wrong approach to mergers and acquisitions in the nonprofit space. I've written before, I think every board, even for the healthiest nonprofits in the world, should have a written strategy around M&A, where they say, okay, we've thought about this proactively. When would we be willing to give up our brand name, to give up our board seats, to give up our executive roles? What are the conditions? And it should be around the mission, not just job preservation or brand preservation. And I know it's a really hard thing. Easy for me to say that. It's really hard to do it.
It's very ego-driven, right? Very ego-driven. I mean,
that's a lot of it. But you're so right. We're not going to get to a results-oriented development industry if we don't have the NGO community actually prioritize those results first and be willing to give something up when it makes sense. When it makes sense to do that.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah. Wow, that's kind of controversial. I like it.
You invited me.
Yeah. That's good. No, that's good. Actually, the idea of having an M&A policy, I will suggest it to my board. I think that's a good idea. We should have.
Yeah,
that.
I mean, otherwise the M&A policy is we wait till we're in trouble. That's or we wait till someone's knocking because they're in trouble. And I just think, if it's about results, and to me, that's the big revolution that I wrote my book about, that I think we're all talking about is a results revolution, right? Moving to putting results as the number one factor in everything we do. And if that's the case, then sometimes it's really hard to do, but it would make sense to think about merging or being acquired.
So another subject, the role of private sector. And private sector is lots of different types, very segmented. You've got the global players, and then you've got the regional players, the national players, etc. We have partnerships with global players. And one of the things we try to be very careful to be sure there's a values alignment. Because an organization that's focused entirely on return for shareholders is not something that necessarily will help the poor. In fact, you've got plenty of evidence that a large number of the global commodities are essentially organized on neo-colonial terms, right? Very extractive in the way. What do you see the role of private sector? What do you see any evolution? There's a lot of talk. I call it words, no action. But I don't know if that's
I think
true.
I think you're right that's the big fear and a big reality. But there's huge potential, right? And the private sector, I remember I once went to a conference and sat next to somebody who was running corporate social responsibility for McDonald's. And he told me that, the day they made the decision to offer apples as an option in the Happy Meal, just as an option, they became the world's #1 buyer of apples that day, right? And only a small percentage of people actually picked apples instead of French fries, as you might expect. But the scale of private sector, and even using the term private sector is crazy given how big it is. It's just, it's massive. We go to all these development humanitarian conferences where there'll be like 1 or 2 private sector representatives. It just doesn't reflect the vastness and diversity of what private sector is. So the potential is enormous if we can do really one key thing, and that's get accountability into this. You're right to say there isn't always accountability. It's still way too easy for some private sector companies to announce big initiatives, to talk a good game, but then at the end of the day, there isn't an accountability mechanism in the way there needs to be. So, it's changing, especially on environmental metrics, where you have many more serious investors who will influence public companies and say, hey, look, we're not going to invest, we're going to influence the cost of getting debt or the cost or the value of your business if you're not hitting certain metrics. But those need to really get to a much broader place around social impact metrics. And there's a lot of work happening on this. I don't want to suggest this is a new thing. Lots of work has gone into this. There are established sets of metrics. There's all these ESG funds that actually invest in these businesses. And there are leaders in the business community doing great things, but we're a long way from real accountability. And I think that's ultimately what's needed. The thing that gives me a lot of encouragement is most of these businesses now, the majority of their workforce are young people. They're millennials or younger. Though if the business values might not be there, the values of their employees are there. And that's a big thing. So and a lot of major businesses today are driven by talent. That's their biggest asset. So you saw Google employees walk out by the thousands over gender discrimination in their business. They wanted to set a statement. If you're the executives at Google, that's like your number one asset just walked out the door in the thousands, right? That's a powerful message.
It is.
So I think there's real potential on this, and we just need to keep pushing it. And those of us who are in the development sector, who partner a lot with private sector, need to do exactly what you're doing. Pick the right partners, make sure there's some value alignment, and then figure out where you can work together on which issues. There's no perfect partner. Most businesses, they may not be perfection there. I saw her walking around in the background.
Exactly.
But I think you're right. You've got to find ways to do this because the scale is enormous when you can get it right.
Raj, the interesting thing is, I've wondered if the international sector, which is engaged in obviously in poverty and hunger and still is and will be, whether or not we're doing enough advocacy and speaking to power, speaking truth to power, and actually do we have a role in holding these folks accountable? Because we know, for example, in the coffee business or the cocoa business, the destruction of families and the poverty and the hunger, the malnutrition is highly prevalent. And the child slavery and all of that. But it doesn't seem, we're depending on the press, we're depending on people like you to actually write it up. Whereas in fact, we are in the field all the time and we see this. And I've always wondered about what our role could be to actually highlight this and systematically report back.
When you think of what are the assets of a major international nonprofit, right? What are the assets of a Heifer? It's your brand. That's your number one asset in many ways, right? It's something you've built this brand over many years with a clear mission. And the reason why a lot of corporates want to partner with international nonprofits isn't just their capabilities and their scale. It's a lot of times it's the brand and the credibility that gives them. They can't get it on their own when they're working on an issue necessarily. So yeah, I think at a minimum, making sure you're only giving them that credibility when they deserve it. When it's the right partner to be working with on the right issue. I think that's important. Now, whether or not you want to call out individual companies, and that gets complicated, but maybe calling out sectors or industries. Heifer has expertise, as you said, in agriculture in a way few other institutions do. And so if you were to come out and say, hey, these are the kinds of practices we're seeing that companies are taking advantage of, even if you're not naming and shaming individual ones, you could still play some role. And that's the kind of report us in the media might be eager to publish, right? Because we're looking for credible information about who's doing what should be held up and what should be criticized.
So one of the questions that came up in the Q&A box is, given all these changes and the project cycle and the kind of training that the development staff is getting today or has been getting, and as you know, as you said, there's a large number of development professionals out there in both countries who move from project to project as well as some permanent work. What's their future?
I think there's the aid industry, the development community, it's getting bigger, not smaller. So I think there are more jobs today than there were, and there will be more jobs 10 years from now. I don't think this is kind of a negative story of an industry that's collapsing, like the newspaper industry or something. I think it's transforming. The thing is, you as a professional have to think, all right, am I transforming myself to keep pace with this? And I think there's a couple of key things there. So one is being able to think in business model terms. Again, it doesn't mean becoming a capitalist and trying to make money, but thinking about market mechanisms. Like, today Gavi had their big announcement, the vaccine initiative. One of the most exciting things that they announced is an advanced market commitment for a COVID vaccine. And essentially all that is, it's a market mechanism that says, hey, if a COVID vaccine is developed that works, that's proven to work and makes it through clinical trials, we're going to set up front, we guarantee there's $2 billion to buy it for the poorest countries in the world. That's what I mean by a market mechanism or a business model.
Yeah.
And if you're a
Yeah.
development professional nowadays, you need to be able to think in those terms, because if you're just thinking about contracts and grants, then you will not be part of this evolution. You've got to think about new ways of moving money out to people who need it and generating results. And I think the other big one is technology. Technology used to be kind of a line item in a budget for a project. There was the tech person who, had a seat at the table or something. That's gone. Like, everyone has to be a technology person. If you're in development, you have to be a technologist. There's no way around it. You can't say, well, I don't really get this stuff, and I'm not really good with this stuff. It doesn't cut it.
Yeah.
Because, in the end, most of the services we're going to be delivering are delivered over a mobile phone, or using a financial inclusion model of some kind that's got some digital currency, or you've got health services are going to be delivered digitally. That's most of the way you're going to scale for the poorest people in the world that today have so little, and you want to move them up quickly. They want to get themselves ahead. It's probably not going to be traditional infrastructure that we see in the West. It's going to be digital. So yeah, I think being fluent in those things will allow people to find new ways to advance their career. And I think there'll be way more jobs. It's just going to be different. It's not just going to be the Western experts flying in, right? There'll be expertise. Maybe you're doing it over Zoom. Maybe just like us, especially after this pandemic, there'll be less travel because you can deliver your expertise from anywhere. But a lot more of the work will happen on the ground with people who are leaders in their own community, really delivering it and leading it.
Interestingly, as you describe what you're talking about, the future, I'm thinking that the private sector employees, the current staffing that they have in Africa and Asia, Latin America, et cetera, are going to be competitors. Some of them are going to want to be doing good, are going to be wanting to, to help their countries one way or the other. And they have all that expertise, right? They're much more familiar with technology. They're much more familiar with market systems. And maybe they're sick and tired of the, chasing the buck all the time.
I tell a story in my book about Accenture Development Partners. You may know them. They're a unit, a nonprofit unit within Accenture, the big consulting business. And they go out there and they try to do good work on projects for NGOs and foundations and others. The way they work is, if you work at Accenture, you're a private sector employee, just like you described, and you want to do development work, you have to sign up to a waiting list and say, I'm willing to take a salary cut that could be as much as 50% or more of my salary I'm giving up to go do development work. So you would think this is a pretty big sacrifice. Well, 10% of Accenture staff are on that waiting list. That's about 50,000 people in a giant private sector company who are waiting, just itching for the chance to lose half their salary to go do some development work. Right?
But elevate their spiritual place
in
the world. That's good. That's good. Oh, wow. That's a hell of a story. That's one hell of a story. Well, I think that's a good place to end, Raj, because that's so uplifting and inspiring that the world has actually got a huge amount of talent that's willing to help solve, some pretty intractable problems. So I want to thank you again. We try to keep these short so that, people will come back, and I don't know, short is better right now. So, but thank you so much, and best of luck with
Pierre.
Devex.
It's been a pleasure.
I'm an avid reader, of course, of Devex, and great job building that media platform. It's been fabulous work.
Thank you. All right, Pierre. Really appreciate that. Great to be with everybody. Really nice to see you.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.